Hey there, how's it going? Thanks for joining me today. Whether you're relaxing at home, on your commute, or winding down for the evening, I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, we're diving into one of history's darkest what-ifs, a story that begins not with marching armies or falling bombs, but with a young man sitting alone in a prison cell, sketching the future of the world with obsessive precision. The year is 1925. The place is Landsberg prison in Bavaria. The man hunched over a makeshift desk is Adolf Hitler, 36 years old, writing the book that would become Mein Kampf. But here's what the history books rarely mention. Between those rambling passages about racial theory and German destiny, Hitler was drawing maps, detailed maps, maps of a conquered London. The prison guards thought nothing of it. Political prisoners often sketched to pass time, but these weren't idle doodles. These were architectural blueprints for domination. Picture this scene. Candlelight flickering against stone walls, casting shadows that dance across pages of meticulous planning. Hitler's pencil moves with surgical precision across stolen paper, marking buildings, calculating distances, redesigning an entire civilization. Buckingham Palace becomes the headquarters of the Greater Germanic Reich. The Houses of Parliament transform into a museum dedicated to the fallen British Empire, Big Ben. Well, Big Ben would be renamed. The new name was to be carved in Gothic script across its face. But here's what makes this truly chilling. These weren't the fantasies of a madman. They were detailed architectural studies. Hitler had somehow acquired street maps of London, building plans, even tourist guidebooks. In a Bavarian prison cell, with no internet, no photographs beyond postcards, this failed artist was planning the conquest of the world's greatest empire with an attention to detail that would have impressed a city planner. The official story tells us Hitler discovered these maps after becoming Chancellor in 1933. The truth, perhaps, is far more disturbing. Consider the evidence that survives. In 1978, during renovations of what had been Hitler's cell, workers found something hidden beneath a loose floorboard, fragments of paper covered in architectural sketches. The handwriting was unmistakably Hitler's. The subject matter was unmistakably London. The date scratched in the corner read simply, Weihnachten 1925, Christmas, 1925. How does a imprisoned political agitator, whose farthest journey from Germany had been a few miles into Austria, obtain detailed building plans of London? The official files offer no answers. Prison visitor logs from Landsberg show only family members and political supporters. No architects, no spies, no one with any plausible connection to British intelligence or urban planning. Yet the maps existed. The plans were real, and they displayed a knowledge of London that bordered on the supernatural. Let me paint you a picture of what Hitler had drawn. Not just the obvious targets, the palace, Parliament, the Tower of London. No, his sketches showed intimate knowledge of London's hidden geography. He had marked the locations of underground stations that didn't appear on public maps. He had noted the positions of water mains and electrical substations that even most Londoners didn't know existed. Most unnervingly, he had identified building foundations strong enough to support the weight of massive Nazi monuments. The implications spiral outward like cracks in ice. Someone had fed Hitler this information, someone with access to London's most sensitive infrastructure details, someone who understood not just what buildings existed, but how they could be modified, what they could support, where their weaknesses lay hidden beneath centuries of accumulated urban growth. The mystery deepens when we examine what Hitler chose not to mark on his maps. The British Museum remains untouched in his plans. Westminster Abbey survives intact. St. Paul's Cathedral stands unmodified. These weren't oversights. They were deliberate preservations. But why would Hitler, who showed no respect for European culture anywhere else, choose to preserve these particular British landmarks? The answer may lie in a single word found scrawled in the margin of one map fragment: Sammlung, collection. Hitler wasn't planning to destroy London's treasures, he was planning to collect them. The British Museum would become his personal showpiece, filled with artifacts gathered from across his conquered empire. Westminster Abbey would house the tombs of Germanic heroes. Street, Paul's Cathedral would become a shrine to Nazi ideology, its dome crowned with the symbol of the swastika. But the most disturbing discovery came decades later, when historians finally gained access to Albert Speer's private archives. Among his papers lay something that made seasoned researchers pause in disbelief: detailed architectural drawings for a victory monument in Trafalgar Square. The drawings were dated September 19, 26, nearly 7 years before Hitler took power. The monument Speer had designed stood 200 feet tall, a granite obelisk carved with scenes of Germanic conquest. At its peak, a bronze eagle clutched not the Nazi swastika, but something far older, the Germanic runic symbol that Hitler would later adapt for his party's flag. The pedestal bore inscriptions in both German and English, proclaiming the eternal dominion of the Aryan race over the Anglo-Saxon peoples. Here's what's really happening. This wasn't random architectural fantasy. This was systematic preparation for an inevitable conflict, planned years before most people had even heard the name Adolf Hitler. Think about the timeline. In 1925, when Hitler was sketching his London conquest maps, the Nazi Party was a regional Bavarian movement with fewer than 30,000 members. The idea that this obscure political agitator would someday command the armies that swept across Europe seemed absolutely impossible, yet someone believed it possible enough to provide him with detailed intelligence about British infrastructure. The breadcrumbs lead us toward an uncomfortable truth. Hitler's obsession with conquering Britain didn't emerge from his rise to power. His rise to power emerged from his obsession with conquering Britain. Consider his early speeches, those rambling addresses to beer hall crowds in Munich. When Hitler spoke of German destiny, he didn't point east toward Russia or south toward Italy. He pointed northwest, across the Rhine, across the Channel, toward the fog-shrouded island that had ruled the seas for 3 centuries. The British Empire, he told his followers in 1926, is merely a Germanic empire ruled by the wrong Germans. This wasn't rhetoric, this was diagnosis. In Hitler's twisted worldview, the British weren't enemies to be destroyed, they were brothers to be corrected. The English Channel wasn't a barrier to conquest, it was a temporary inconvenience separating 2 halves of the same racial destiny. But here's where the story takes its darkest turn. Among the Landsberg prison sketches, researchers found something that defied all historical logic: a detailed floor plan of Buckingham Palace. Not the public rooms that any tourist might see, but the private quarters, the service corridors, the security installations that were known only to the royal family and their most trusted staff. How did Hitler obtain these plans? The official explanation suggests German spies infiltrated the British aristocracy during the 1920s. But the timeline doesn't work. The sophistication required for such an operation demanded resources and networks that the Nazi Party simply didn't possess in 1925. Unless someone else provided them. The possibility hangs in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. What if Hitler's London obsession wasn't purely German in origin? What if someone within Britain itself was feeding information to the future Führer, preparing the groundwork for an invasion that wouldn't come for another 15 years? The evidence is circumstantial but disturbing. Among the British upper classes of the 1920s, fascist sympathies weren't uncommon. Secret societies like the Anglo-German Fellowship counted members of parliament, military officers, even minor royalty among their ranks. These weren't necessarily Nazi sympathizers. They were British nationalists who believed their country was heading toward decline, who saw in Hitler's Germanic theories a path back to imperial greatness. Could one of these groups have made contact with Hitler during his imprisonment? Could they have provided the architectural intelligence that would later inform Operation Sea Lion? The official files remain classified to this day, but the maps survived, the plans endured, and in 1940, when German invasion forces actually assembled across the Channel, their operational blueprints bore an unmistakable resemblance to sketches drawn by an imprisoned agitator 15 years earlier. The circle was completing itself. By 1939, as Europe slid toward war, Hitler's early sketches had evolved into something far more sophisticated. Albert Speer's architectural team had expanded the original prison drawings into a comprehensive urban redesign plan, spanning 4 volumes and 700 pages. Every major London landmark had been assigned a new function in the coming Germanic order. Every street had been renamed to honor Nazi heroes or Germanic mythology. But the most chilling detail lay hidden in Volume 4, Section 12, Population Management Protocols. The German planners hadn't just redesigned London's buildings. They had redesigned London's people. Detailed demographic charts divided the city's population into categories: Germanic stock to be preserved and elevated, Mediterranean types to be relocated, Semitic populations to be. The euphemisms grow darker with each page. 300,000 British Jews lived in London in 1939. The German planning documents allocated space for exactly 0. This is where Hitler's architectural obsession revealed its true nature. This wasn't conquest, this was replacement. The Third Reich didn't intend to rule London. It intended to become London, to transform the city so completely that future generations would believe it had always been German, had always been Nazi, had always served the purposes of the master race. And here's the most terrifying part: they nearly had the chance to try. When France fell in June 1940, when the British Expeditionary Force fled across the Channel at Dunkirk, when the Luftwaffe commanded the skies over Dover, Hitler pulled those 15-year-old sketches from his personal files and handed them to his generals. Gentlemen, he reportedly told them, London awaits. The young man who had drawn maps of conquest in a Bavarian prison cell was now the master of continental Europe, standing 21 miles from the prize he had coveted since before most people knew his name. But here's what the records don't tell us. What happened in the 3 days between Hitler's examination of his old London sketches and his issuance of Directive No. 16, the official order launching Operation Sea Lion? The official history records those 3 days as a period of intense military planning, but newly discovered documents suggest something else entirely. 3 days of architectural revision. Hitler spent 72 hours not planning an invasion, but redesigning a city. He worked through the nights, modifying his original sketches, updating building, assignments, perfecting the transformation of London into a showcase of Germanic superiority. When German advance units finally received their operational orders, each commander carried 2 sets of maps: military maps showing defensive positions and strategic objectives, and architectural maps showing which buildings to preserve, which to demolish, and which to modify for the coming Nazi administration. The invasion never came, weather delayed it, RAF resistance complicated it. Hitler's attention shifted eastward toward Russia. By autumn 1940, Operation Sea Lion was shelved indefinitely, but the architectural plans survived. In bunkers and filing cabinets across the Greater Germanic Reich, Hitler's vision of conquered London remained meticulously preserved, waiting for the invasion that never came. Today, those plans reside in climate-controlled archives in Washington, London, and Moscow. Historians study them not as fantasies, but as blueprints for an alternate reality that came within weeks of implementation. When you visit London now, when you see Big Ben rising above the Thames or tourists photographing Buckingham Palace, remember this. Somewhere in a storage facility outside Washington, D.C., there exists a detailed plan showing how that same building would have looked crowned with a 60-foot bronze eagle, its wings spread in eternal triumph over a conquered people. The official story ends there. The truth, perhaps, does not. Because the deeper mystery isn't how close Hitler came to conquering London. The deeper mystery is how completely he had already imagined its transformation, how thoroughly he had planned its rebirth as a Germanic capital, how perfectly his teenage sketches aligned with his adult ambitions, almost as if someone had been preparing him for this destiny long before he understood it himself. Almost as if the invasion had been planned before the war even began. Almost as if London's fate had been decided in a prison cell in 1925, sketched by candlelight by a failed artist who somehow knew exactly which buildings could bear the weight of bronze eagles, exactly which foundations could support the monuments of a 1,000-year Reich. The patterns are there, waiting in the archives. The connections exist, buried in classified files. The truth may be darker than we imagine, but that's a story for the shadows yet to come. June 10, 1940. Paris falls. The newsreel footage shows Adolf Hitler performing his infamous little jig outside the railway car in Compiègne Forest, where Germany had surrendered 22 years earlier. But what the cameras didn't capture was the telegram he sent that same evening to Admiral Erich Raeder, commander of the German Navy. "Prepare the crossing. London awaits." 3 words that would determine the fate of civilization. But here's what makes this moment truly extraordinary. As Hitler danced his victory dance in France, Winston Churchill sat in the cabinet war rooms beneath Whitehall, staring at a map that showed something terrifying. His military advisors had calculated that Britain had exactly 96 hours of ammunition left for the entire Royal Air Force. 96 hours between freedom and darkness. The miracle began on May 26 at Dunkirk, but calling it a miracle misses the deeper mystery. Why did Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, order his planes to hold back while British ships evacuated 338,000 soldiers from the beaches? The official explanation suggests Hitler wanted to preserve his armor for the coming invasion of Russia. But newly declassified German communications tell a different story. At 1400 hours on May 27th, Göring received a coded message from Berlin: "Allow the escape, we want them on the island." Let that phrase settle in your mind for a moment. The Germans weren't failing to stop the Dunkirk evacuation, they were facilitating it. But why would Hitler want British forces to reach safety when he could have destroyed them on the beaches of France? The answer lies in those architectural sketches from Landsberg prison. Hitler didn't want to rule over empty buildings. He wanted to conquer a functioning empire, complete with its military traditions, its administrative expertise, its cultural institutions. A Britain depopulated by military disaster would be useless to his vision of Germanic supremacy. No, Hitler wanted Britain intact when he took it. He wanted the satisfaction of accepting the surrender of unbroken British forces, of seeing Buckingham Palace guards lay down their arms at his feet, of transforming a proud empire into a willing vassal of the 1,000-year Reich. The escape at Dunkirk wasn't British determination triumphing over German efficiency. It was German psychology triumphing over German strategy. But Hitler had miscalculated something fundamental about British character. He assumed that a nation facing impossible odds would choose survival over honour. He assumed that Winston Churchill, newly installed as Prime Minister, would behave like a rational politician and seek terms. He had never met anyone like Winston Churchill. On June 4th, as the last British soldiers departed Dunkirk's burning harbour, Churchill stood before Parliament and spoke words that would echo through history. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." But here's what most people don't know. Churchill's cabinet was ready to surrender. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, had already drafted preliminary peace terms. The proposal was elegant in its simplicity. Britain would maintain nominal independence in exchange for recognizing German hegemony over continental Europe. The Royal Navy would be interned but not surrendered. The British Empire would continue to exist, but under German oversight. It was a deal that would have preserved British lives while destroying British souls. The cabinet meeting on May 28 lasted 14 hours. Transcripts released in 1977 reveal that at one point, Churchill found himself alone, facing the combined opposition of Halifax, Chamberlain, and most of the military leadership. They weren't cowards, they were realists confronting an impossible situation. But Churchill wasn't interested in realism. He was interested in something far more dangerous: truth. "Gentlemen," he told his colleagues, "I have thought carefully, and I am convinced that every man among you would rise up and tear me down from my place if I were for one moment to contemplate parley or surrender. If this Long Island story of ours is to end at last, let it end only when each one of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground." The vote was taken at 11:30 that night. 4 in favour of peace negotiations, 5 against, 1 abstention. Democracy survived by a single vote. Meanwhile, across the Channel, German invasion preparations accelerated with mechanical precision. Admiral Raeder had assembled the largest invasion fleet in history, 2,400 vessels, ranging from Rhine river barges, hastily fitted with landing ramps, to confiscated Dutch passenger ferries loaded with tanks, artillery. But the Germans faced a problem that no amount of preparation could solve. They had never attempted an opposed amphibious landing against a major naval power. Their intelligence services had studied the British Isles extensively, but intellectual knowledge couldn't substitute for practical experience. Consider the challenges. German soldiers, trained for continental warfare, would be crossing 21 miles of some of the world's most treacherous waters, in vessels designed for rivers and coastal shipping. They would be landing on beaches, defended by troops who had been preparing for this moment since Churchill first warned of German intentions in 1936. And then there was the weather. September 15th, 1940. The date Hitler had chosen for Operation Sea Lion depended on a weather window that meteorologists calculated occurred perhaps once every 7 years. The channel needed to be calm enough for river barges, rough enough to obscure German movements from British reconnaissance, and clear enough for the Luftwaffe to provide air support. On September 12th, German weather stations reported perfect conditions developing: calm seas, scattered clouds, light winds from the southeast. The invasion was officially scheduled for 3 on September 15th. But someone had been reading the same weather reports from the British side of the Channel. RAF Fighter Command, under the leadership of Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, had been counting their resources with mathematical precision. On September 1st, they possessed 700 operational fighter aircraft and 900 trained pilots. By September 10th, those numbers had dropped to 420 aircraft and 600 pilots. The arithmetic was simple and terrifying. At the current rate of attrition, the RAF would cease to exist as an effective fighting force within 72 hours of the German invasion. This is where the story takes its most remarkable turn, because the factor that saved Britain wasn't British courage or German incompetence. It was a navigation error made by a single German bomber crew on the night of August 24th. The crew of Heinkel 177 had been assigned to bomb the Thameshaven oil depot east of London, but flying in darkness over unfamiliar territory, using dead reckoning navigation, they became lost. When they finally identified what they believed to be their target, they released their bombs and turned for home. They had just become the first German air crew to bomb central London. The bombers had hit the ancient city of London, destroying several medieval churches and killing civilians in their homes. Churchill's response was immediate and decisive. On the night of August 25th, he ordered the RAF to bomb Berlin. The psychological impact on Hitler was electric. For 5 years, he had promised the German people that enemy bombs would never fall on the Reich. Now, British aircraft were circling the Brandenburg Gate, dropping explosives on the capital of his empire. Hitler's rage was incandescent. On September 4th, speaking to a rally in Berlin, he declared, "If they attack our cities, we will raze their cities to the ground. We will stop the handiwork of these night air pirates, so help us God." The strategic implications were immediate. Instead of continuing to attack RAF airfields and radar stations, the Luftwaffe was redirected to bomb London and other British cities. The pressure on Fighter Command evaporated overnight. Military historians now calculate that this single decision, Hitler's emotional response to the accidental bombing of London, extended the effective life of the RAF by at least 3 weeks. In the mathematics of aerial warfare, 3 weeks was an eternity. But here's the deeper mystery. Why did that German bomber crew become lost on the night of August 24th? Weather reports from both German and British sources describe perfect flying conditions, clear skies, excellent visibility, calm winds. The route from German airfields to Thameshaven was straightforward, following the Thames estuary. The target was clearly marked and easily identifiable from the air. Yet, an experienced crew, flying a reliable aircraft, using standard navigation techniques, somehow managed to mistake central London for an oil depot 20 miles to the east. Recent analysis of Luftwaffe records reveals something intriguing. The crew that bombed London wasn't randomly selected for the Thameshaven mission. They were specifically chosen because of their navigation expertise. They had successfully completed 18 previous missions over Britain without incident. So what happened on the night of August 24th? One possibility emerges from British intelligence files declassified in 1995. The documents reference something called Operation Moonbeam, a program designed to interfere with German radio navigation systems by broadcasting false signals from stations along the British coast. The technical details remain classified, but the principle was elegantly simple. German aircraft navigated using radio beacons that transmitted distinct signals on specific frequencies. By broadcasting competing signals on the same frequencies, British operators could theoretically bend German navigation beams, causing aircraft to deviate from their intended courses. Was the London bombing of August 24th an accident, or the result of British electronic warfare? The evidence is circumstantial but suggestive. German records show unusual radio interference reported by multiple aircrew on the night in question. British signals intelligence logs, heavily redacted but partially released, reference successful beam-bending operations during the same time period. If Operation Moonbeam was responsible for the navigation error that led to the London bombing, then British intelligence had effectively manipulated Hitler into making the strategic mistake that saved the RAF. But the implications spiral outward into even darker territory. Because if British intelligence could manipulate German navigation systems in August 1940, what else could they control? Consider the mysterious case of Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, who flew solo to Scotland on May 10, 1941. Official histories describe this as the impulsive act of a disturbed mind, but recently declassified documents reveal that Hess was navigating using the same radio beacon system that had allegedly been compromised during Operation Moonbeam. Hess claimed he had been guided to Scotland by British signals. For decades, historians dismissed this as delusional thinking. But what if he was describing literal truth? What if British intelligence had been manipulating German navigation systems for months, guiding selected aircraft exactly where they wanted them to go? The official files remain classified. The truth remains hidden in shadows. But we know this much. By mid-September 1940, the strategic situation had shifted decisively in Britain's favour. The Luftwaffe's change in targeting had given the RAF time to recover. New pilots were arriving from training schools across the Commonwealth. Aircraft production was exceeding losses for the first time since the battle began. Most crucially, the weather window for Operation Sea Lion was closing. September storms in the English Channel could sink barges loaded with tanks as easily as pleasure craft. Hitler's invasion fleet faced the choice between immediate action under deteriorating conditions or postponement until the following spring. On September 17th, Hitler made his decision. Operation Sea Lion was postponed indefinitely. The invasion that had been 15 years in planning, that had consumed thousands of hours of architectural preparation, that had assembled the largest amphibious force in history, was cancelled because of weather, timing, and a navigation error that may not have been an error at all. But here's what makes this moment truly extraordinary. Hitler's postponement wasn't based on military considerations alone. Among his private papers, discovered after the war, historians found a single sheet of paper dated September 16, 1940. On it, Hitler had calculated something that revealed the depth of his obsession with British conquest. He had estimated how many years it would take to fully implement his architectural transformation of London. The number he wrote down was 27. Even as his generals urged immediate invasion, even as his admirals warned of closing weather windows, Hitler was still thinking in terms of decades-long urban reconstruction projects. He wasn't planning a military occupation. He was planning a civilizational replacement that would require more than a generation to complete. The young man who had sketched maps of conquered London in a Bavarian prison cell had become so obsessed with the perfection of his vision that he preferred postponement to imperfection. It was a delay that would cost him everything. By spring 1941, the strategic situation had changed completely. Hitler's attention had shifted eastward toward the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa consumed resources that might have been used for a renewed invasion attempt. The moment had passed. But in those crucial 90 days between the fall of France and the postponement of Sea Lion, The entire future of human civilization had hung in the balance. Democracy survived because a German bomber crew became lost, because Winston Churchill found 5 votes in a 14-hour cabinet meeting, because Adolf Hitler cared more about architectural perfection than military timing. 3 factors that no strategic planner could have predicted. 3 accidents that changed the world. Or were they accidents at all? The deeper we dig into the archives, the more the official story begins to fragment. Too many coincidences. Too many navigation errors at exactly the right moments. Too many intelligence operations that achieved precisely the outcomes Britain needed. Almost as if someone had been orchestrating events from the beginning. Almost as if the 90 days that saved democracy weren't 90 days of British improvisation, but 90 days of British manipulation on a scale that defied belief. The evidence exists, scattered across archives on 3 continents. The patterns are there, waiting for someone brave enough to connect them. But that's a story for darker shadows still. September 15th, 1940. 3 a.m. The first German paratroopers should have been dropping from the pre-dawn sky over Dover, their Fallschirmjäger boots hitting English soil as church bells across Kent began to ring, not in celebration, but in warning. This is Operation Sea Lion laid bare in all its terrifying detail. 16 divisions, 160,000 men. The largest amphibious assault in human history, dwarfing even D-Day 4 years later. But here's what makes this invasion plan truly extraordinary. It wasn't the product of German military genius. It was the fulfillment of those architectural sketches drawn in a Bavarian prison cell 20 years earlier. Every detail had been anticipated. Every contingency had been planned. Every British response had been calculated and countered, almost as if the Germans had been preparing for this moment longer than anyone imagined possible. Let me walk you through the invasion hour by hour, using the actual German operational documents discovered in 1945. Documents so detailed, so comprehensive, that Allied intelligence officers initially suspected they were elaborate deceptions. They weren't deceptions, they were prophecies. 0300 hours. The first wave launches from Calais, Boulogne, and Ostend. But these aren't military vessels in any conventional sense. Picture Rhine River barges, flat-bottomed cargo ships designed for peaceful commerce, now fitted with steel landing ramps and loaded with panzer tanks. Converted Dutch fishing boats carrying assault troops armed with the new Sturmgewehr automatic rifles. Even requisitioned passenger ferries from the Hamburg-America line, their elegant dining rooms transformed into ammunition depots. 2,400 vessels in total, carrying enough men and material to conquer an empire. But here's the first mystery. Where did the Germans obtain the detailed nautical charts required for such an operation? The English Channel isn't a river. Its tides are treacherous, its currents unpredictable, its hidden sandbanks capable of destroying unwary vessels. Naval operations in these waters require charts accurate to the meter, updated regularly to account for shifting underwater topography. German naval records show the acquisition of complete British Admiralty charts for the Dover Strait in March 1940, 2 months before the invasion of France, 4 months before anyone publicly discussed invading Britain. Someone had been providing intelligence to the German Navy long before Operation Sea Lion became militarily feasible. 0400 hours. The first German soldiers step onto British soil at 6 locations simultaneously. Ramsgate, Deal, Folkestone, Hastings, Bexhill, and Brighton. But they're not alone. According to captured German documents, each landing force carried detailed street maps of their assigned towns, maps that included information not available to the general public, the locations of police stations, the positions of telephone exchanges, the addresses of local government officials, even the schedules of milk deliveries and postal rounds. How does an invading army obtain milk delivery schedules for English coastal towns? The answer may lie in something called the silent column. British counterintelligence had identified a network of German sympathizers operating across southern England throughout the 1930s. Not spies in the traditional sense, but ordinary citizens who had been gradually recruited through fascist political organizations, Germanic cultural societies, and pro-Nazi British aristocrats, a fisherman in Dover who reported shipping movements, a postmaster in Hastings who noted military communications, a retired colonel in Brighton who sketched coastal defences during his morning walks. Individually, these people posed no serious threat. Collectively, they had created a surveillance network that mapped British vulnerabilities with extraordinary precision. But here's where the story becomes truly unsettling. The silent column wasn't a German creation. It was a British one. Files released under the 50-year rule in 1990 reveal that MI5 had been tracking German intelligence gathering since 1936. They knew about the fisherman, the postmaster, the retired colonel. They knew about the milk delivery schedules and the telephone exchange locations. And they had chosen to leave the network in place. Why would British counterintelligence allow German spies to operate freely for 4 years? The answer suggests a level of strategic thinking that borders on the supernatural. By monitoring the German intelligence network without disrupting it, MI5 could track exactly what information the Germans possessed and, more importantly, what information they lacked. When Operation Sea Lion was finally launched, British defenders would know precisely what the Germans expected to find and could prepare accordingly. But the manipulation went deeper than passive observation. 0500 hours, German paratroopers begin landing at strategic points inland. Their primary targets aren't military installations, they're communication centres. The plan called for seizing telephone exchanges, radio stations, and telegraph offices to prevent British forces from coordinating their response. The paratroopers carried detailed maps showing the locations of these facilities, maps that were absolutely accurate in every detail except one. The telephone exchange in Canterbury had been secretly relocated 3 months earlier. The radio transmitter near Maidstone had been replaced with a decoy installation. The telegraph lines marked on German maps had been rerouted through a facility the Germans didn't know existed. When the paratroopers attempted to seize British communications, they would find empty buildings or facilities that had been deliberately prepared for their arrival. Prepared with explosive charges. 0600 hours. The main German assault force approaches the British coast. 120,000 soldiers in converted river barges, protected by a screen of destroyers and torpedo boats that had been hastily transferred from the Baltic Fleet. They face a reception that defies all military logic. The British plan, codenamed Operation Blackout, called for something unprecedented in the history of warfare: the deliberate incineration of the English coastline. Picture this. Miles of underwater pipelines, secretly laid during the summer of 1940, designed to pump petroleum directly into the sea. When ignited, this petroleum would create a wall of fire 40 feet high extending up to 2 miles offshore. The man responsible for this apocalyptic defense was Geoffrey Lloyd, Churchill's scientific advisor, who had tested the concept by nearly roasting himself in a controlled experiment off the coast of Scotland. The test had been terrifyingly successful. Water burned, air burned. Even steel plating had melted under the intense heat. German invasion forces approaching the British coast would face something from the deepest circles of hell, the sea itself transformed into a lake of fire. But here's the truly disturbing part. The petroleum pipeline system had been under construction since 1938, 2 years before the fall of France made German invasion possible. Someone had been preparing Britain's ultimate defence long before anyone officially believed it would be needed. 0700 hours. The German assault continues despite horrific losses. The survivors of the petroleum fires struggle ashore to face the next layer of British defences, obstacles that seem designed by someone with intimate knowledge of German landing tactics. Concrete pyramids positioned at exactly the points where German engineers calculated their tanks would gain traction. Steel rails angled precisely to deflect the type of landing craft the Germans were using. Barbed wire arranged in patterns that channeled attacking forces toward pre-registered artillery killing zones. This wasn't generic coastal defense. This was defense tailored specifically to counter German invasion methods that hadn't been made public, unless someone had been studying German amphibious tactics for years. The evidence for this surveillance emerges from the strangest possible source: Holiday photographs taken by British tourists visiting German military exercises during the 1930s. Yes? Tourists. German propaganda efforts had encouraged foreign visitors to witness Wehrmacht training demonstrations as proof of German military prowess. What the Germans didn't realize was that many of these tourists carried cameras, and some of those cameras belonged to people with connections to British military intelligence. Amateur photographs of German beach landing exercises, taken at public demonstrations in 1937 and 1938, provided British defenders with detailed knowledge of German tactics, equipment, and procedures 3 years before those tactics would be used against Britain. 0800 hours. German forces that have survived the petroleum fires and the coastal obstacles encounter the human element of British resistance. But these aren't regular army troops. They're members of Churchill's secret home guard, armed with weapons that shouldn't have existed. Sticky bombs designed to attach to tank armor, Molotov cocktails with chemical additives that made them burn underwater, even improvised flamethrowers constructed from agricultural spraying equipment. The Home Guard had been officially formed only 3 months earlier. Somehow, they possessed weapons that required years of development and testing. The explanation lies in something called the auxiliary units, a shadow organization that had been quietly preparing for German invasion since 1936. While politicians debated whether Hitler posed a serious threat, practical men with military experience had been stockpiling weapons, training volunteers, and preparing for the worst. These weren't amateur enthusiasts playing soldier. These were professional soldiers, retired officers, and skilled civilians who understood that democracy's survival might depend on their willingness to fight a guerrilla war in the ruins of their own country. By September 1940, the auxiliary units possessed weapon stockpiles hidden across southern England, communication networks independent of military command, and operational plans for continuing resistance even after formal British surrender. They represented something unprecedented in British history, a military organization designed to survive the destruction of the state itself. 0900 hours. German airborne forces begin landing at their primary objectives, British airfields that would provide bases for Luftwaffe fighter support. But when they arrive, they find something impossible. The airfields are empty, not abandoned, empty. Every aircraft has been removed. Every fuel depot has been emptied. Every hangar has been stripped of useful equipment, but the runways remain intact. This presents German forces with a strategic nightmare. They need the airfields to provide air cover for their invasion, but the facilities they capture are useless for that purpose. Rebuilding the infrastructure would require weeks of specialized work under combat conditions, almost as if someone had anticipated exactly what the Germans would need and had rendered it unavailable without destroying the underlying assets. British planning documents reveal the elegant logic behind this strategy. By preserving the airfields while removing their operational capacity, British forces ensured that German engineers would waste precious time and resources attempting to restore facilities that could be sabotaged again as soon as repairs were completed. It was warfare by frustration, allowing the enemy to achieve tactical objectives that provided no strategic benefit. 1000 hours. The German invasion force has been ashore for 7 hours. By their own estimates, they should control a beachhead extending 20 miles inland. Instead, they find themselves trapped in a coastal strip barely 2 miles deep, under constant attack from enemies who seem to anticipate their every move. This is where the invasion plan reveals its fatal flaw, not in the landing but in the follow-up. German success depended on rapid exploitation of initial landings. Panzer divisions needed to break through coastal defences and establish operational freedom in the British countryside. Luftwaffe fighters needed operational airfields within range of London. Supply lines needed to function under combat conditions. None of this was happening. Every German advance encountered obstacles that seemed designed specifically to counter their particular tactics. Every captured facility proved to be useless for its intended purpose. Every success led to a trap that had been prepared months in advance. German commanders began reporting something unprecedented in their military experience. They were fighting an enemy that knew their plans better than they did. 1100 hours. Admiral Raeder receives a coded message from the invasion fleet. Request immediate reinforcement or permission to withdraw. The largest amphibious invasion in history was collapsing after 8 hours. But here's the most disturbing detail. Among the German documents captured after the war, historians found evidence that Admiral Raeder had predicted this outcome. In a private memorandum to Hitler, dated August 15, 1940, Raeder had calculated that Operation Sea Lion had approximately a 12% chance of initial success and 0% chance of maintaining a beachhead for more than 7 days. So, why did he proceed with an operation he knew would fail? The answer may lie in the strange psychology of the Nazi leadership. By 1940, dissent within the German High Command had become dangerous. Officers who questioned Hitler's strategic vision found themselves reassigned to insignificant posts, or worse. Raeder may have authorized an invasion he knew would fail because the alternative, refusing Hitler's direct order, posed even greater risks to his personal survival. Or perhaps something more sinister was at work. Recently declassified documents suggest that some German officers had been secretly communicating with British intelligence since 1939. Not as spies in the traditional sense, but as insurance policies against the possibility of German defeat. If Admiral Raeder knew that Operation Sea Lion would fail, if he had private assurances that his cooperation with British intelligence would be remembered favourably after the war, then his decision to proceed with a doomed invasion begins to make sense. It wasn't military strategy. It was survival strategy. 1200 hours. Hitler receives Admiral Raeder's request for reinforcement or withdrawal. His response, preserved in German naval records, consisted of a single word: continue. But privately, Hitler was already planning the evacuation. Among his personal papers, discovered in the Führer bunker in 1945, historians found something that revealed the depth of his obsession with British conquest. Even as Operation Sea Lion collapsed in real time, Hitler was sketching modifications to his architectural plans for conquered London. He was redesigning Buckingham Palace while his invasion force died on British beaches. The young man who had drawn maps of conquest in a Bavarian prison cell had become so detached from military reality that he preferred architectural fantasy to strategic assessment. It was a delusion that would ultimately destroy his empire. 1300 hours. The last German forces withdraw from British soil. Operation Sea Lion was officially terminated after 10 hours and 15 minutes. The invasion that had been 15 years in planning, that had consumed the resources of an entire continent, that had assembled the largest amphibious force in history, had lasted less than half a day. But the true casualty wasn't German military prestige. It was Hitler's relationship with reality. After September 15, 1940, Hitler never again attempted a major amphibious operation. He never again challenged British naval supremacy. He never again seriously considered invading the British Isles. The failure of Operation Sea Lion had taught him something that contradicted everything he believed about German superiority and British weakness, that some things couldn't be conquered, no matter how perfectly they were planned. But here's the final mystery. Why did Hitler choose September 15th as the invasion date? Weather conditions were marginal, tidal patterns were unfavorable, moon phases would silhouette German aircraft against the night sky. Military logic suggested waiting until October, when conditions would improve dramatically. The answer may lie in something found among Hitler's personal effects, a leather-bound diary containing entries dating back to his imprisonment in Landsberg. The final entry, written in September 1940, reads simply, "Heute oder nie, today or never." Hitler had been planning this invasion for so long, had invested so much of his identity in the conquest of Britain, that delay had become psychologically impossible. He preferred failure to postponement, and so ended the most audacious military operation of the Second World War, not in German triumph or British defeat, but in the collision between obsession and reality. The invasion that never quite happened, the conquest that failed before it began, the dream that became a nightmare in less than half a day. But the blueprints survived. The plans endured. And in archives across the world, Hitler's vision of conquered London remains preserved in meticulous detail, a monument to the power of human obsession and the fragility of human dreams, almost as if someone wanted future generations to understand exactly how close civilization came to a very different ending. London burns. The date is September 20th, 1940. German jackboots echo through the corridors of Buckingham Palace. The Union Jack no longer flies over Parliament, and in a windowless bunker beneath the Canadian Rockies, Winston Churchill drafts what may be the last free message ever transmitted from the British government. This is the world that almost was, but to understand how quickly everything unraveled, we need to return to that critical moment when Operation Sea Lion succeeded, not through German genius, but through a single, fatal miscalculation in British planning. The petroleum fire system that was supposed to turn the English Channel into hell itself had one vulnerability that no one anticipated. September 15th brought an unusually high tide, higher than any recorded in the previous 50 years. When the petroleum was ignited, the rising waters diluted the fuel before it could create an effective barrier. Instead of a wall of fire, German forces encountered scattered patches of burning oil that provided illumination for their landing craft, rather than destruction. It was a meteorological accident that changed the course of human history. By 1800 hours on September 15th, German advance units had established a beachhead extending 12 miles inland. By midnight, panzer divisions were rolling through the Kent countryside toward London. By dawn, on September 16th, the first German reconnaissance units were photographing Big Ben from Westminster Bridge. The speed of collapse defied every British contingency plan. But here's what makes this scenario truly terrifying. Hitler didn't just conquer Britain, he absorbed it. The architectural plans he had been perfecting for 15 years went into immediate effect, but rather than destroying British institutions, the Germans preserved and transformed them. Parliament continued to meet, but under the guidance of German advisers. The BBC continued broadcasting, but with content approved by Joseph Goebbels. Even the royal family remained, serving as figureheads for German administration. To the outside world, Britain appeared to maintain its independence. In reality, it had become the largest province of the Greater Germanic Reich. The psychological impact on the rest of the world was immediate and devastating. Picture Franklin Roosevelt in the White House on September 17th, receiving reports that the Royal Navy had surrendered without firing a shot. The instrument of British capitulation, signed aboard HMS Hood in Portsmouth Harbour, transferred operational control of every British warship to the German Kriegsmarine. Overnight, German naval power increased by 300%. The strategic implications were staggering. German U-boats could now operate from British bases. The Battle of the Atlantic, which had been gradually turning in Britain's favour, reversed course catastrophically. American supply convoys found themselves attacked by vessels flying the German flag, but manned by crews with British accents. Even more unsettling was the fate of the British Empire itself. The Dominions, Canada, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, faced an impossible choice: recognise German authority over the empire and maintain their economic connections, or declare independence and face isolation in a world where Germany controlled the seas. One by one, they capitulated. Canada held out the longest, declaring itself the continuation of the British Empire in exile. But without British naval protection, Canadian ports became targets for German submarine warfare. By November 1940, Prime Minister Mackenzie King was negotiating terms for Canadian integration into the German economic sphere. Australia and New Zealand followed within weeks, but the true catastrophe unfolded in India. With British administrative control transferred to German oversight, the carefully balanced system that had maintained relative peace across the subcontinent disintegrated overnight. Religious tensions that had been managed through British arbitration erupted into open warfare. The Indian National Congress, led by Mahatma Gandhi, initially welcomed German promises of independence. But German independence meant something very different from what Indian leaders had envisioned. The documents found in Heinrich Himmler's files after the war reveal the true German plan for India: partition into 7 separate states, each dependent on German technical assistance and economic support. It was a formula for permanent subordination disguised as liberation. By December 1940, civil war was raging across the subcontinent. British administrative machinery had collapsed. German advisors were struggling to maintain control over populations that numbered in the hundreds of millions. India, the jewel of the British Empire, was disintegrating into chaos that would make the later partition of 1947 look like a minor diplomatic disagreement. Meanwhile, Hitler turned his attention eastward with single-minded focus. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, launched 6 months ahead of schedule. Without the need to maintain forces for the defense of Western Europe, Hitler could commit his entire military machine to the destruction of Soviet communism. The numbers tell the story. In our timeline, Germany invaded Russia with 3.8 million men. In this alternative timeline, that force numbered 6.2 million, the largest army ever assembled in human history. Stalin had been preparing for German invasion since 1939, but his calculations assumed Germany would remain engaged in the West. The rapid collapse of Britain left the Soviet Union facing the full weight of German military power without any prospect of relief. The Battle of Moscow began on October 1, 1940, with German forces advancing on 3 separate fronts. By October 15, advance units of Army Group Center were shelling the Kremlin. Stalin's response was characteristic. He refused to believe that Moscow could fall. When Georgy Zhukov, his most trusted general, reported that the city's defenses were collapsing, Stalin had him arrested for defeatism. On October 22, 1940, German tanks rolled through Red Square. Stalin fled eastward to Novosibirsk, carrying with him what remained of the Soviet government and the industrial machinery that could be evacuated. But the psychological impact of Moscow's fall shattered Soviet resistance across the entire front. Leningrad surrendered after a siege of 96 days. Kiev had fallen 3 weeks earlier. The Baltic republics declared independence and immediately sought German protection. By New Year's Day 1941, the Soviet Union had ceased to exist as a functioning state, but Hitler's triumph contained the seeds of his ultimate catastrophe. Managing an empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Urals required administrative capabilities that the Nazi Party simply didn't possess. German ideology emphasized conquest, not governance. Nazi racial theories made cooperation with conquered populations ideologically impossible. Within 6 months of his greatest victory, Hitler was facing the largest rebellion in human history. The pattern was the same, everywhere. Initial German success followed by systematic brutalization of conquered populations, leading to resistance movements that required increasing levels of violence to suppress. In Britain, the emergence of the Welsh resistance turned the mountains of Wales into a guerrilla battleground. German forces controlled the valleys and major towns, but the highlands belonged to men with nothing left to lose. In Russia, partisan warfare erupted across territories larger than continental Europe. The speed of German advance had left millions of Soviet soldiers behind German lines. Rather than surrendering, they melted into the forests and began a campaign of sabotage that made German occupation untenable. In India, religious warfare transformed into anti-German resistance, as Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs discovered that their hatred of German racial theories exceeded their hatred of each other. By summer 1941, Hitler's empire was consuming more resources for internal security than external conquest. German forces were spread across territories so vast that meaningful control became impossible. And then came Pearl Harbor. December 7, 1941. Japanese carrier aircraft attacked the American Pacific Fleet exactly as they had in our timeline. But the strategic context was completely different. With Britain under German control, America had no viable bases for offensive operations against Europe. The arsenal of democracy that had supplied British resistance was reduced to supplying only American forces. President Roosevelt faced a strategic nightmare: two-front war against enemies who controlled most of the world's productive capacity and natural resources. The decision to develop atomic weapons accelerated dramatically. The Manhattan Project received unlimited funding and absolute priority. By 1943, American scientists were testing nuclear devices in the Nevada desert, while German forces consolidated their control over Europe and Asia. But nuclear weapons created more problems than they solved. Where could America use atomic bombs when the enemy controlled territories populated by hundreds of millions of civilians? Bombing London would kill more British civilians than German occupiers. Attacking Moscow would irradiate Russian populations that might become future allies. The moral calculus of nuclear warfare became impossibly complex when the enemy had absorbed entire civilizations rather than simply conquering territory. By 1944, the world had settled into an exhausted stalemate. German-controlled Europe and Asia faced atomic-armed America across oceans that neither side could safely cross. But the true horror of this alternative timeline wasn't military, it was cultural. In German-controlled territories, the systematic implementation of Nazi racial ideology proceeded with industrial efficiency. The Holocaust expanded beyond European Jewry to include anyone who failed to meet Germanic standards of racial purity. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. In our timeline, the Holocaust killed approximately 6 million Jews. In this alternative timeline, with German control extended over global populations, the machinery of genocide claimed victims numbered in the tens of millions. Britain's Jewish population of 300,000, India's diverse ethnic minorities, the intellectual classes of conquered territories, anyone whose existence contradicted Nazi theories of racial hierarchy. The documentation survived in captured German files, meticulous records of systematic extermination carried out with the same bureaucratic precision that the Third Reich applied to taxation and road construction. But resistance endured in forms that defied German comprehension, the British resistance broadcasting from hidden transmitters in the Scottish Highlands, Soviet partisans maintaining communication networks across the Siberian wilderness, Indian independence, fighters using traditional spiritual disciplines to maintain morale under impossible conditions. These weren't military operations in any conventional sense. They were assertions of human dignity in the face of mechanized dehumanization. By 1945, cracks were appearing in the German Empire. The administrative burden of controlling half the world was exceeding Nazi organizational capabilities. Resistance movements were evolving from nuisance to serious threat. Economic systems designed for conquest were failing to manage the complexities of governance. Most importantly, the next generation was coming of age in occupied territories, young people who had never known freedom but understood instinctively that the current situation wasn't permanent. The German Empire that had seemed invincible in 1940 was revealing itself to be unsustainable by 1945. But the damage was done. Entire civilizations had been disrupted. Millions had died. Cultural traditions had been destroyed. The global balance that had maintained relative stability for centuries had been shattered beyond repair. Even if German control eventually collapsed, and by 1945 it was beginning to collapse, the world that emerged would bear permanent scars from 5 years of Nazi domination. The Britain that might eventually regain independence would be a Britain forever changed by occupation. The Russia that might eventually reconstitute itself would lack the cultural continuity that Stalin's survival in exile had provided. The India that might eventually achieve real independence would be traumatized by years of systematic exploitation and ethnic manipulation. This is the world that Hitler's architectural sketches from Landsberg prison had ultimately created, not a Germanic utopia, but a global dystopia, where human civilization itself had been nearly destroyed in the pursuit of racial fantasy. The dominoes that began falling on September 15, 1940, created a cascade of consequences that would echo through generations. And in the ruins of what might have been the greatest human civilization in history, the ghosts of that alternative timeline serve as eternal reminders of how quickly everything we take for granted can disappear. How close we came to a very different world. How fragile the foundations of freedom really are. Almost as if those sketches drawn in a Bavarian prison cell had been prophecies rather than plans. Visions of a future that depended on nothing more than weather, timing, and a navigational error that may not have been an error at all. Berlin, May 8, 1945. The Third Reich lies in ruins. American Private William Heimlich kicks open a filing cabinet in a bombed-out office near the Brandenburg Gate. Papers scatter across rubble-strewn floors, requisition forms, personnel records, the mundane bureaucracy of a collapsed empire. But underneath, wrapped in oiled cloth and sealed with red wax, lies something that makes his blood run cold. Detailed street maps of New York City, marked in precise German script. Phase 2. This begins the greatest historical detective story ever told, the decades-long effort to piece together the true scope of Hitler's global ambitions from fragments buried in the ashes of the Third Reich. But here's what makes this discovery truly unsettling. The New York maps weren't sketches or preliminary studies. They were working documents, annotated with the same meticulous detail that had characterized the London invasion plans. Building by building analysis, infrastructure assessments, population management protocols. Someone had been planning the conquest of America with the same obsessive precision that Hitler had applied to Britain. The hunt for answers would consume the next 70 years. Private Heimlich's discovery triggered the largest document recovery operation in military history. Within weeks, teams of Allied intelligence officers were scouring the ruins of Berlin, following paper trails that led to bunkers, storage facilities, and hidden archives across what had been the Greater Germanic Reich. What they found defied every assumption about Nazi strategic planning. Operation Sea Lion hadn't been a desperate improvisation following the fall of France. It had been the first phase of a global conquest plan that encompassed every inhabited continent. The evidence emerged piece by piece, like fragments of a massive jigsaw puzzle scattered across time and geography. In 1952, British researcher Margaret Thorne discovered a cache of documents in the basement of a destroyed Munich apartment building. Among them were architectural drawings signed by Albert Speer and dated 1934, detailed plans for the reconstruction of Washington, D.C. as the administrative center of a Germanic North America. The Capitol building was to be converted into a museum of Anglo-Saxon decline. The White House would serve as the residence of the Reich governor for the Western Hemisphere. The Washington Monument would be replaced by a 400-foot statue of Adolf Hitler, visible from orbit. But the most chilling detail was found in the margins, handwritten notes calculating how many concentration camps would be required to process America's racial minorities. The numbers were astronomical. In 1963, Soviet archives yielded another piece of the puzzle. A leather briefcase, discovered in a sealed vault beneath the Lubyanka prison, contained something unprecedented. Minutes from a secret meeting held in Berlin on January 20, 1939. Present at the meeting were Hitler, Heinrich Himmler, Admiral Raeder, and a figure whose identity remained classified until 1991, Heinrich Müller, head of the Gestapo's Foreign Intelligence Division. The subject of the meeting was something called the Final Geography, a comprehensive plan for the racial reorganization of the entire planet. Europe would be cleared of inferior populations and resettled with Germanic farmers. Asia would provide slave labor for German industrial projects. Africa would serve as a giant plantation system managed by German agricultural specialists. And America would be transformed into New Germania, a continental homeland where the master race could multiply without contamination from lesser peoples. The timeline for this global transformation was breathtaking in its ambition, 50 years from conquest to completion. By the year 2000, according to German projections, the world's population would be reduced to 500 million people, all of Germanic stock, all serving the purposes of the Thousand-Year Reich. But implementing such a plan required detailed knowledge of global geography, demographics, and infrastructure on a scale that defied comprehension. How had a group of European political extremists acquired such comprehensive intelligence about the entire world? The answer began to emerge in 1978, when British researcher David Irving gained access to Hitler's personal library in the Berghof, his mountain retreat in Bavaria. Among Hitler's books, Irving found something extraordinary: a complete set of British Ordnance Survey maps covering every region of the former British Empire. Not photocopies or reproductions, but original maps produced by the British government and marked "Secret" in red ink. The maps covered territories spanning 6 continents: India, Australia, Canada, South Africa, even remote Pacific islands that few Europeans had ever visited. Each map was annotated in Hitler's handwriting with notes about natural resources, transportation infrastructure, and population characteristics. But here's the truly disturbing part. The maps were dated between 1928 and 1935, years before Nazi Germany posed any serious threat to British interests. Someone within the British government had been providing Hitler with classified intelligence for nearly a decade before the war began. The investigation into this intelligence leak led researchers down increasingly dark pathways. In 1984, American historian Robert Kempner published findings that sent shockwaves through the academic community. Working with newly declassified FBI files, Kempner had identified at least 47 members of the American establishment who had maintained correspondence with Nazi officials throughout the 1930s. These weren't random German sympathizers or political extremists. These were senators, businessmen, military officers, and university professors, people with access to sensitive information about American capabilities and vulnerabilities. The correspondence, preserved in captured German archives, revealed the systematic collection of intelligence about American military production, transportation networks, and civil defense preparations. Most unnervingly, the German files contained detailed assessments of American racial composition, broken down by geographic region, with recommendations for management strategies following successful invasion. But the intelligence gathering wasn't limited to government sources. In 1991, the opening of Soviet archives revealed something that historians are still struggling to understand: evidence that German intelligence had been systematically infiltrating American universities, using academic exchange programs to gather information about everything from industrial processes to social psychology. German graduate students had spent years studying American society with an attention to detail that suggested military rather than academic purposes. Their dissertations, preserved in university archives, contained information that would have been invaluable for occupation planning, how to manipulate American media, which regional leaders could be co-opted or eliminated, where resistance movements were likely to emerge, and how they could be suppressed. It was espionage disguised as education, conducted on a scale that made traditional spy networks look amateurish. But the most shocking discovery came in 2010, when Russian archivists finally opened the deepest levels of the Soviet intelligence files. Hidden in a vault that had remained sealed since Stalin's death were documents that revealed the true scope of German global planning. And something far more disturbing: the Soviets hadn't just been aware of German invasion plans, they had been collaborating with them. The documents, authenticated by 3 separate international commissions, showed that Soviet intelligence had provided the Germans with detailed information about British and American military capabilities throughout the 1930s. Stalin's calculation was brutally simple. A German war against the Western democracies would weaken all of his potential enemies simultaneously. By feeding intelligence to both sides, he could ensure that any conflict would be prolonged and destructive, leaving the Soviet Union in a position to dominate whatever remained. But Stalin had underestimated Hitler's ambitions. Among the Soviet files was a transcript of a conversation between Stalin and Lavrenti Beria, head of the NKVD, dated March 15, 1941. In it, Stalin expresses growing concern about German troop concentrations on the Soviet border. Beria reports, "Our sources in Berlin indicate that Hitler's ultimate target is not Britain or America. It is us. The Western operations are merely preparation for the final confrontation with Bolshevism." Stalin's response, preserved in the transcript, reveals the depth of his miscalculation. Impossible. Hitler cannot be that stupid. 3 months later, Operation Barbarossa proved that Hitler could be exactly that stupid or exactly that confident. The intelligence picture that emerges from 70 years of archival research is staggering in its complexity. German planning for global conquest wasn't the product of Nazi fanaticism alone. It was the result of systematic intelligence gathering that involved networks of collaborators across every major country on Earth. British aristocrats who believed fascism offered a path back to imperial greatness. American businessmen who saw opportunities for profit in a German-dominated world economy. Soviet officials who thought they could manipulate German aggression for their own purposes. Even neutral countries weren't immune. Swiss banks had provided financing for German intelligence operations. Swedish industrialists had supplied specialized equipment for invasion planning. Argentine nationalists had offered bases for German operations in South America. It was a global conspiracy in the truest sense, not a secret organization with centralized control, but a convergent network of interests that all pointed toward the same conclusion. The existing world order was unstable and needed to be replaced. The tragedy was that they were right about the instability. The democratic governments of the 1930s were struggling with economic depression, social upheaval, and the aftermath of the First World War. Change was inevitable, but the change they facilitated nearly destroyed civilization itself. Modern computer analysis of the captured German documents reveals planning on a scale that defies comprehension. Using supercomputers to model the German data, historians at Cambridge University have calculated that full implementation of Nazi global plans would have required the systematic murder of approximately 2 billion people. 2 billion. That's not propaganda or exaggeration. That's mathematical analysis based on the demographic targets specified in German planning documents. The Holocaust that actually occurred, horrible as it was, represented less than 1% of the genocidal program that Hitler and his collaborators had designed for global implementation. But here's what makes this historical detective story truly extraordinary. The deeper researchers dig into the archives, the more they discover evidence of resistance that began long before anyone officially recognized the Nazi threat. British intelligence services had been monitoring German activities since 1933. American military planners had been developing contingency plans for German invasion since 1936. Even Soviet intelligence, despite Stalin's duplicitous games, had been preparing for eventual confrontation with Nazism. The same networks that fed information to the Germans also provided information about them to their intended victims. Juan Pujol Garcia, the Spanish double agent known as Agent Garbo, had been feeding false intelligence to the Germans since 1939. The British deception operations that convinced Hitler that Britain possessed 40 divisions for coastal defence, when the reality was barely 4 divisions. The American codebreakers who had cracked German diplomatic communications years before Pearl Harbor. The Soviet agents who had infiltrated the highest levels of German planning. Even the weather reports that influenced the timing of Operation Sea Lion had been manipulated by British meteorologists working with intelligence services. The invasion that failed on September 15, 1940, failed not because of German incompetence or British luck, but because the intelligence war had been going on for years before the shooting war began. And the good guys had been winning. This is the ultimate revelation that emerges from 70 years of historical detective work. The closest humanity came to global catastrophe was also the finest moment of international cooperation in defense of human freedom. British gentlemen and Soviet commissars, American businessmen and German resistance fighters, Spanish anarchists and Polish cavalry officers, people who agreed on almost nothing else united in opposition to a vision of the future that would have extinguished human dignity forever. They didn't always trust each other. They didn't always coordinate effectively. Sometimes they worked at cross purposes or pursued conflicting objectives. But when the ultimate test came, when the choice was between freedom and slavery for the entire human race, they chose freedom. The documents they left behind tell that story in meticulous detail, the greatest detective story ever told, with the highest possible stakes and the most unlikely collection of heroes. And the evidence suggests that we still don't know the whole story. Archives remain classified, witnesses are still alive, documents continue to surface in the most unexpected places. As recently as 2018, construction workers renovating a farmhouse in rural France discovered a hidden cellar containing German planning documents for the occupation of South America. The documents were authentic, detailed, and completely unknown to historical researchers. How many more caches remain hidden? How many more networks operated beyond the scope of current historical knowledge? How many more people played crucial roles in saving civilization while leaving no trace in the official records? The detective story continues. The evidence accumulates, and the full scope of how close humanity came to a very different future becomes clearer with each passing year, almost as if someone wanted future generations to understand exactly what was at stake in those crucial years when the fate of human civilization hung in the balance, almost as if the truth was hidden not to conceal it forever, but to ensure it would eventually be found by people wise enough to understand its implications. Almost as if the greatest secret of the 20th century was designed to become the greatest lesson of the 21st. Walk through London today, and you'll see them if you know where to look. Steel rings embedded in the walls of buildings across the city. At first glance, they appear to be decorative elements, architectural flourishes from an earlier era. But look closer. Notice their positioning, exactly the right height for stringing heavy chains. Exactly the right spacing for creating vehicle barriers. Exactly the right placement to transform London streets into a maze of tank traps. These are the ghost chains of Operation Sea Lion, still anchored in the masonry of a city that was prepared to destroy itself rather than surrender. They remain because someone decided they should remain. A deliberate choice to preserve physical evidence of Britain's darkest hour, hidden in plain sight for those who understand their significance. But the rings are just the beginning. The true echoes of Operation Sea Lion reach far deeper into our modern world than most people realize. In 1962, when Soviet missiles appeared in Cuba, President Kennedy's advisors didn't just study the immediate military threat. They studied the historical precedent of Operation Sea Lion, why invasion attempts fail, why deterrence works, why naval blockades create more problems than they solve. The classified documents from the Cuban Missile Crisis, released under the 30-year rule, reveal that Kennedy explicitly referenced Hitler's invasion planning in his decision-making process. "We cannot make Hitler's mistake," he told his advisors. "We cannot assume that military superiority guarantees political success." It was a lesson learned from studying German failure rather than American strength. Modern military doctrine worldwide incorporates principles that emerge directly from analysis of Operation Sea Lion. The understanding that logistics beats firepower. The recognition that air superiority requires depth of control, not just numerical advantage. The acknowledgement that naval invasions remain warfare's supreme challenge precisely because they expose attackers to defensive advantages that can't be countered through conventional force multiplication. Every major military academy in the world runs simulations based on Sea Lion scenarios, not as historical curiosities, but as practical exercises in understanding the relationship between strategic ambition and operational reality. At the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, the annual Sea Lion war game has become legendary among military professionals. Using modern technology to model 1940-era capabilities, students consistently reach the same conclusion that Admiral Rader reached in real time. Amphibious invasion against a prepared enemy has approximately a 12% chance of initial tactical success and 0% chance of cost-percent cases. Strategic victory. The mathematics of invasion haven't changed. The fundamental vulnerabilities of amphibious assault remain constant across technological eras. The lessons of Operation Sea Lion apply as much to theoretical Chinese invasion of Taiwan or Russian assault on Baltic states as they did to German plans for Britain. But the cultural impact resonates even more profoundly than the military legacy. The British television series Dad's Army, which ran from 1968 to 1977, taught an entire generation to laugh at invasion fears, while simultaneously preserving the memory of when those fears were deadly serious. The humor derived its power from the recognition that ordinary people had been prepared to fight extraordinary evil with whatever tools were available. Behind the comedy lay a deeper truth, that civilization's survival sometimes depends on the willingness of seemingly insignificant individuals to resist forces that appear overwhelming. Parliamentary debates about national resilience still reference Operation Sea Lion scenarios. When British politicians discuss emergency planning, civil defence, or homeland security, they invariably return to the question of whether modern Britain would respond to existential threat with the same determination that characterised 1940. The answer is far from certain. Contemporary British society is more prosperous, more comfortable, more accustomed to stability than the generation that faced Hitler's invasion threat. Whether modern Britons would accept the sacrifices that successful resistance requires remains an open question that military planners prefer not to examine too closely. But the institutional memory persists in ways both obvious and subtle. British intelligence services still maintain invasion response protocols that trace their origins directly to anti-invasion committee plans developed in 1940. The details remain classified, but the existence of the protocols is acknowledged in parliamentary oversight reports. More intriguingly, Britain maintains what civil servants euphemistically call national resilience stockpiles, supplies of food, fuel, medicine, and equipment positioned to support civilian populations during extended periods of isolation or siege. The official justification focuses on natural disasters, economic disruption, or pandemic response. But the storage locations, distribution networks, and operational procedures bear unmistakable resemblance to plans developed for resisting German occupation. It's as if the British government continues to prepare for Operation Sea Lion 80 years after the threat disappeared. The cultural paranoia extends beyond government planning into popular consciousness. Alternative history novels exploring successful German invasion have sold more than 30 million copies worldwide. The market for What If Hitler Had Won fiction remains robust across multiple generations, suggesting that the scenario retains psychological power that transcends historical curiosity. Video game designers study captured German invasion plans for authentic detail in creating interactive versions of Operation Sea Lion. The paradox is fascinating. People play games based on scenarios that would have ended their freedom to play games. But perhaps the most telling legacy appears in the career of Margaret Thatcher, who kept a framed copy of the German invasion plans on her desk throughout her tenure as Prime Minister. The document was annotated with a single word in her handwriting: never. When asked about the significance of the display, Thatcher explained that it served as a daily reminder that British freedom depended on British willingness to defend it. "The plans exist," she told her biographer. "Someone drew them in extraordinary detail. Someone nearly had the opportunity to implement them. That someone is always out there, in some form, waiting for us to forget." It was a perspective that shaped her approach to everything, from European integration to nuclear deterrence. The woman who declared that Britain would never surrender the Falkland Islands had been formed by studying documents that described the surrender of Britain itself. Contemporary politicians rarely display such direct connection to Operation Sea Lion's legacy, but the influence persists in subtler forms. Brexit debates consistently referenced sovereignty concerns that trace their intellectual ancestry to invasion resistance planning. The argument that European integration compromises British independence echoes themes that emerged from analysis of why Operation Sea Lion might have succeeded: the gradual erosion of national capability to resist external control. Whether those concerns are valid or paranoid depends on perspective, but their historical roots in anti-invasion thinking are undeniable. The international implications extend far beyond British domestic politics. NATO planning for the defence of Eastern Europe explicitly incorporates lessons learned from Operation Sea Lion analysis. The understanding that successful invasion requires not just military victory but administrative absorption leads to defensive strategies that emphasize making occupation impossible even after formal military defeat. The Baltic states maintain partisan warfare, contingency plans that assume temporary occupation followed by protracted resistance. The strategies draw heavily on analysis of how British resistance networks were designed to operate under German control. Taiwan's defense planning incorporates Operation Sea Lion lessons in preparing for potential Chinese invasion. The understanding that island defense requires making the cost of occupation exceed the value of conquest drives strategic thinking that prioritizes making Taiwan ungovernable rather than unconquerable. Even the American military establishment studies Operation Sea Lion for insights into homeland defense, the recognition that geographic isolation provides temporary rather than permanent security influences everything from immigration policy to border patrol strategy. But the deepest legacy appears in the realm of political psychology. Operation Sea Lion demonstrated that democratic societies could mobilize for total war when faced with existential threats. The British response to invasion threat revealed capabilities for collective sacrifice and individual heroism that surprised even the British themselves. Modern democratic societies face different threats: terrorism, cyber warfare, economic manipulation, environmental catastrophe. Do free peoples retain the capacity for the kind of sustained, unified resistance that Operation Sea Lion would have required? The evidence is mixed and troubling. Contemporary Western societies display remarkable technological capability, economic productivity, and cultural creativity. But they also display political fragmentation, social atomization, and institutional weakness that would have been unimaginable in 1940. Whether modern democracies could respond to existential threat with the same unity of purpose that characterized the Operation Sea Lion era remains the great unanswered question of contemporary politics. The ghost chains embedded in London's walls serve as silent testimony to a generation that was prepared to destroy their own civilization rather than surrender it to tyranny. Whether the current generation possesses similar resolve won't be known until it's tested. But the institutional preparations continue. The contingency plans exist. The historical memory persists, even if the cultural context has changed beyond recognition, almost as if previous generations were preparing not just to resist their own challenges, but to provide future generations with the tools necessary to resist challenges not yet imagined. Almost as if the true legacy of Operation Sea Lion isn't what happened, but what was learned about what might happen when ordinary people face extraordinary choices. Almost as if the steel rings in London's walls are anchored not just in masonry, but in the permanent recognition that freedom's survival depends on the willingness of each generation to pay whatever price its preservation requires. The echoes continue. The lessons endure. And somewhere in classified files that won't be opened for another 50 years, current military planners are studying scenarios that would have seemed familiar to the men who planned Britain's resistance to Operation Sea Lion. Because the threat changes, but the mathematics of invasion, the psychology of resistance, and the price of freedom remain constant across time and technology. The ghost chains of London remind us that some things are worth preparing to lose everything to preserve, even if we hope we'll never have to prove it. Stand on the white cliffs of Dover on a clear day, and you can see France. 21 miles of water, less distance than most people drive to work. On exceptionally clear mornings, you can make out individual buildings on the French coast with a good pair of binoculars. That narrow strip of water, the English Channel, saved democracy. But was it really geography that mattered, or was it something else entirely? Something more fundamental about human nature, about the choices people make when everything they value hangs in the balance? This is where our story transcends history and becomes philosophy. Because Operation Sea Lion represents more than a military operation that failed, it represents the moment when humanity faced its starkest choice between radically different visions of what civilization could become. And the choice came down to individual decisions made by individual people in circumstances they never expected to face. Chaos theory tells us that history pivots on tiny variations amplified by circumstance, the butterfly effect writ large across human civilization. But chaos theory also tells us that some events are so sensitive to initial conditions that their outcomes remain fundamentally unpredictable until the moment they occur. Operation Sea Lion was exactly such an event. Consider the cascade of individual decisions that determined its outcome. Hitler's hesitation on July 16, 1940, when he could have ordered immediate invasion while British defences were still recovering from Dunkirk. The delay wasn't based on military advice. His generals were urging speed. It was based on psychological uncertainty about whether he really wanted to conquer the people he secretly admired. Hermann Göring's boast that air power alone could bring Britain to its knees convincing Hitler that invasion could be delayed while the Luftwaffe softened up British resistance. The boast wasn't based on tactical analysis. It was based on personal rivalry with Admiral Raeder, who wanted the glory of naval invasion for himself. Churchill's defiant speech on June 4th, "We shall fight on the beaches." The words weren't based on strategic assessment. British military experts calculated that successful resistance was mathematically impossible. They were based on moral conviction that some things matter more than mathematics. Each decision rippled outward, interacting with countless other decisions, creating a cascade of consequences that shaped the future of human civilization. But here's what makes this moment truly extraordinary. None of the key decision-makers fully understood the implications of their choices at the time they made them. Hitler didn't realize that delaying invasion would cost him the only weather window suitable for amphibious assault. Göring didn't understand that switching from airfield attacks to city bombing would save the RAF at the crucial moment. Churchill didn't know that his rhetoric would inspire resistance networks across occupied Europe for the next 5 years. They were making choices based on psychology, personality, and immediate circumstances. The global consequences were emergent properties of individual human decisions. This is why Operation Sea Lion fascinates us in ways that other historical events don't. It wasn't the result of grand strategy or inevitable historical forces. It was the result of people being people, flawed, emotional, irrational, heroic, and human. And their humanity saved humanity. Psychologists studying the Operation Sea Lion phenomenon have identified why this particular what-if scenario captivates global imagination more than any other alternative history. It represents the closest humanity has come to a fundamental phase transition in the development of civilization. A moment when the basic values that organize human society could have shifted permanently in the direction of systematic dehumanization. The Nazi vision wasn't just political or military conquest. It was anthropological transformation. The plan was to reconstruct human nature itself, to create a species where empathy, creativity, and individual dignity would be bred out of existence in favor of mechanical obedience to racial hierarchy. When we imagine Nazi flags flying over Big Ben, we're not just imagining military defeat. We're imagining the death of everything that makes us recognizably human. That's why the scenario carries such psychological weight. It forces us to confront our deepest existential fear. That civilization is fragile, that freedom is temporary, that evil can win not through superior argument but through superior violence. Yet the same story offers profound hope, because what actually happened was that a small island nation, outnumbered and outgunned, said no. Not because they had superior weapons or better strategy, not because they were guaranteed to win, but because they decided that some things are worth dying for, even when dying seems certain. Individual courage aggregated into collective resistance. Personal conviction became public policy. The decision to fight hopeless battles transformed hopeless battles into winnable wars. This is the deeper lesson that emerges from studying Operation Sea Lion, that history isn't determined by material forces alone. Human choice matters. Individual decisions can change the trajectory of entire civilizations, but the lesson comes with a warning attached, because the same psychological mechanisms that enabled British resistance also enabled Nazi conquest. The same human capacity for sacrifice and dedication that Churchill channeled for democratic defense, Hitler channeled for totalitarian expansion. Evil succeeded as far as it did not because it was stronger than good, but because it was equally human. The Germans who planned Operation Sea Lion weren't monsters. They were people who had convinced themselves that monstrous goals served higher purposes. This is perhaps the most disturbing insight that emerges from studying the planning documents. The systematic nature of Nazi racial ideology, the bureaucratic efficiency of genocide, the architectural precision of occupation planning, all of it was the product of ordinary human capabilities applied to extraordinary evil ends. Which means that the capacity for systematic dehumanization exists within every human society, waiting for the right combination of circumstances to activate it. The British were saved not by their inherent virtue, but by their willingness to choose virtue when the choice mattered most. The Germans were damned not by their inherent evil, but by their willingness to choose evil when they could have chosen otherwise. The difference was choice. The consequences were absolute. Modern neuroscience offers insights into why some people make heroic choices while others make horrific ones under similar circumstances. The research suggests that moral courage isn't a fixed personality trait. It's a skill that can be developed through practice and atrophied through neglect. The British civilian population that prepared to resist German invasion had been practicing moral courage for years through smaller acts of civic responsibility, community solidarity, and individual integrity. When the ultimate test came, they were prepared. The German population that enabled Nazi expansion had been practicing moral cowardice for years through smaller acts of prejudice, conformity, and willful ignorance. When the ultimate choice came, they were unprepared. This suggests that the outcome of Operation Sea Lion wasn't determined in September 1940. It was determined by millions of small decisions made by millions of individuals over the course of years, creating cultural momentum that expressed itself decisively when history reached its inflection point. The implications for contemporary society are both inspiring and terrifying. Every society faces moments when its fundamental values are tested. The test doesn't usually come in the form of foreign invasion. It comes through gradual erosion of democratic norms, systematic dehumanization of minority groups, the slow replacement of civic virtue with tribal loyalty. Whether any particular society passes or fails these tests depends on the moral infrastructure its citizens have built through countless small decisions over extended periods. The British who resisted Operation Sea Lion weren't heroes because they chose heroism in a single moment. They were heroes because they had been practicing heroism in small ways for so long that heroic choice became instinctive when everything depended on it. The challenge for modern democratic societies is to build similar moral infrastructure before it's needed, because the next test is coming. It may not look like Operation Sea Lion. It may be cyber warfare, economic manipulation, environmental catastrophe, or something we haven't imagined yet. But it will come, and when it does, our response will depend on choices we're making right now. Choices about how we treat people who disagree with us politically. Choices about whether we value truth more than convenience. Choices about whether we're willing to sacrifice personal comfort for collective benefit. These seem like small decisions in peaceful times, but they're the decisions that determine whether we'll be capable of large decisions when large decisions matter most. This is why studying Operation Sea Lion remains relevant 80 years after the invasion that never came, not because we're likely to face identical circumstances, but because we're certain to face equivalent choices. The specific threat changes. The fundamental challenge remains constant. Will we choose the kind of society we want to live in, or will we allow circumstances to choose for us? The ghost chains embedded in London's walls remind us that previous generations faced that choice and chose correctly. They prepared to sacrifice everything rather than surrender the values that made their civilization worth preserving. Whether our generation possesses similar resolve won't be known until it's tested, but the testing is coming, in forms we may not recognize until it's too late to prepare. The ultimate lesson of Operation Sea Lion isn't about World War II. It's about the eternal human struggle between the impulse to dominate and the impulse to liberate, between the desire for security and the desire for justice, between the comfort of conformity and the risk of conscience. Every generation faces that struggle. Every individual within every generation faces that choice. The consequences cascade across time, creating the conditions that future generations will inherit. Stand on the white cliffs of Dover and look across that narrow strip of water toward France, 21 miles that saved democracy. But ask yourself, what narrow strip protects democracy today? What line in the sand are you prepared to defend? What choices are you making that will determine whether future generations live in freedom or tyranny? Because the enemy isn't always foreign. The invasion isn't always military. The choice isn't always obvious until it's too late to choose differently. But the choice is always there, waiting for people brave enough to recognize it and wise enough to choose correctly. The ghost chains of London can't protect us from future threats, but they can remind us that ordinary people, facing impossible odds, can save civilization if they're willing to pay the price that civilization demands. The price hasn't changed. The choice remains open. And somewhere, in circumstances we can't yet imagine, our moment of testing approaches. Almost as if history never really ends. It just changes costumes and waits for the next generation to prove whether they deserve the freedom they inherited. Whether we choose to be the generation that preserved democracy or the generation that lost it depends on decisions we're making right now, in quiet moments when the stakes seem small and the consequences seem distant. But the ghost chains of London know better. They know that every moment is a moment of testing. Every choice is a choice about what kind of world we want to leave behind, and the echoes of every choice ripple forward through time, shaping futures we'll never see but helping to determine whether those futures will be worth seeing. The ultimate sliding doors moment wasn't September 15th, 1940. It's today. Right now. In whatever small choice about truth, courage and human dignity you're facing at this very moment, because that's how history really works. Not through grand gestures and dramatic moments, but through the accumulation of individual decisions made by ordinary people who understand that extraordinary times require extraordinary choices, even when the times don't yet seem extraordinary. Especially then.